This book is called The 100 Dresses, and it's one of my favorites. It's by Eleanor Estes and illustrated by Slobodkin. Title page, The 100 Dresses. This is a little letter to the readers, and it says, "When I am asked about my mother's book, The 100 Dresses, I often wonder what to say. What more meaning could my words give to a book that, although written 60 years ago, continues to reach the hearts of children around the world? What answers could I give the children who still write letters of thanks and praise to my mother? Is this a true story?" they ask. "Did this happen to you?" Well, most stories are based on both fact and fiction, and certainly this is true for The 100 Dresses. Years ago, I asked my mother why she had written that story, and she told me about a classmate in her elementary school who had been taunted because she wore the same dress to school every day, and because her Polish name was unusual and difficult for many to pronounce. My mother was in school during World War I, and Polish names were uncommon then in the small town of West Haven, Connecticut, where my mother grew up and where the story takes place. So we're going to skip this part and go right into the story. Contents. Chapter 1 is called Wanda. Wanda. Today, Monday, Wanda Petronsky was not in her seat. But nobody, not even Peggy and Madeline, the girls who started all the fun, noticed her absence. Usually, Wanda sat in the next to the last seat in the last row in room 13. She sat in the corner of the room where the rough boys who did not make good marks on their report cards sat. The corner of the room where there was the most scuffling of feet, most roars of laughter when anything funny was said, and most mud and dirt on the floor. Wanda did not sit there because she was rough and noisy. On the contrary, she was very quiet and rarely said anything at all, and nobody had ever heard her laugh out loud. Sometimes she twisted her mouth into a crooked sort of smile, but that was all. Nobody knew exactly why Wanda sat in the seat, unless it was because she came all the way from Boggan's Heights, and her feet were usually caked with dry mud that she picked up coming down the country roads. Maybe the teacher liked to keep all the children who were apt to come in with dirty shoes in one corner of the room, but no one really thought much about Wanda Petronsky once she was in the classroom. The time they thought about her was outside of school hours, at noontime when they were coming back to school, or in the morning early before school began, when groups of 2 or 3 or even more would be talking and laughing on their way to the schoolyard. Then sometimes they waited for Wanda to have a little fun with her. The next day, Tuesday, Wanda was not in school either, and nobody noticed her absence again except the teacher and probably Big Bill Byron, who sat in the seat behind Wanda's and who could now put his long legs around her empty desk, one on each side, and sit there like a frog to the great entertainment of all in his corner of the room. But on Wednesday, Peggy and Maddie, who sat in the front row along with other children who got good marks and didn't track in a whole lot of mud, they did notice that Wanda wasn't there. And Peggy was the most popular girl in school. She was pretty, she had many pretty clothes, and her auburn hair was curly. Maddie was her closest friend. The reason Peggy and Maddie noticed Wanda's absence was because Wanda had made them late to school. They had waited and waited for Wanda to have some fun with her, and she just hadn't come. They kept thinking she'd come any minute, and they saw Jack Bagels running to school, his necktie all askew, and his cap at a precarious tilt. They knew it must be late, for he always managed to slide into his chair exactly when the bell rang, as though he were making a touchdown. Still, they waited 1 minute more, and 1 minute more, hoping she'd come. But finally, they had to race off without seeing her. The 2 girls reached their classroom after the doors had been closed. The children were reciting in unison the Gettysburg Address, for that was the way Miss Mason always began the session. Peggy and Maddie slipped into their seats just as the class was saying the last lines. "That these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. The dresses game. After Peggy and Maddie stopped feeling like intruders in a class that had already begun, they looked across the room and noticed that Wanda was not in her seat. Furthermore, her desk was dusty and looked as though she hadn't been there yesterday either. Come to think of it, they hadn't seen her yesterday. They waited for a while, but had forgotten about her when they reached school. They often waited for Wanda Petronsky to have fun with her. Wanda lived way up on Boggins Heights, and Boggins Heights was no place to live. It was a good place to go and pick wildflowers in the summer, but you always held your breath till you got safely past Old Man Svensson's yellow house. People in the town said Old Man Svensson was no good. He didn't work, and worse still, his house and yards were disgracefully dirty, with rusty tin cans strewn about, and even an old straw hat. He lived alone with his dog and his cat. No wonder, said the people of the town, who would live with him? And many stories circulated about him, and the stories were the kind that made people scurry past his house even in broad daylight and hope not to meet him. Beyond Svensson's house, there were a few small scattered frame houses, and in one of these, Wanda Petronsky lived with her father and her brother Jake. Wanda Petronsky. Most of the children in room 13 didn't have names like that. They had names easy to say like Thomas or Smith or Allen. There was one boy named Bounce, Willie Bounce, and people thought that was funny, but not funny in the same way that Petronsky was. Wanda didn't have any friends. She came to school alone and she went home alone. She always wore a faded blue dress that didn't hang quite right. It was clean, but it looked as though it had never been ironed properly. She didn't have any friends, but a lot of girls talked to her. They waited for her under the maple trees on the corner of Oliver Street, or they surrounded her in the schoolyard as she stood watching some little girls play hopscotch on the worn hard ground. Wanda, Peggy would say in the most courteous manner, as though she were talking to Miss Mason or the principal, perhaps. Wanda, she'd say, giving one of her friends a nudge, tell us, how many dresses did you say you had hanging in your closet? 100, said Wanda. 100, exclaimed all the girls incredulously, and the little girls would stop playing hopscotch and listen. Yeah, 100, all lined up, said Wanda, and then her thin lips drew together in silence. What are they like? All silk, I bet, said Peggy. Yeah, all silk, all colors. Oh, velvet too? Yeah, velvet too. 100 dresses, repeated Wanda stolidly. All lined up in my closet. And then they'd let her go, and then before she'd gone very far, they couldn't help bursting into shrieks and peals of laughter. 100 dresses. Obviously, the only dress Wanda had was the blue one she wore every day. So what did she say she had 100 for? What a story. And the girls laughed derisively while Wanda moved over to the sunny place by the ivy-covered brick wall of the school building, where she usually stood and waited for the bell to ring. But if the girls had met her at the corner of Oliver Street, they'd carry her along with them for a way, stopping every few feet for more incredulous questions, and it wasn't always about dresses that they talked about. Sometimes it was hats or coats or even shoes. How many shoes did you say you had? 60, would reply Wanda. 60? 60 pairs or 60 shoes? Oh, 60 pairs all lined up in my closet. Yesterday you said 50. Well, now I've got 60. Cries of exaggerated politeness greeted this. Ooh, all alike, said the girls. Oh no, said Wanda, every pair is different, all colors, all lined up. And Wanda would shift her eyes quickly from Peggy to a distant spot as though she was looking far ahead, looking but not seeing anything. Then on the outer fringe of the crowd, the girls would have paid any attention to Wanda if Peggy hadn't. The girls wouldn't have paid any attention if Peggy hadn't invented the dresses game. But suppose Peggy and all the others started in on her next. She wasn't as poor as Wanda, but she was poor. Of course she would have more sense than to say 100 dresses. Still, she wouldn't like it if they began on her. Not at all. Oh dear, she did wish Peggy would stop teasing Wanda Petronsky. One more chapter, and that's all I'm going to read. A bright blue day. Somehow Maddie could not buckle down to work. She sharpened her pencil, turning it around carefully in the little red sharpener, letting the shavings fall into a neat heap on a piece of scrap paper, and trying not to get any of the dust from the lead on her clean arithmetic paper. A slight frown puckered her forehead. In the first place, she didn't like being late to school. And in the second place, she kept thinking about Wanda. Somehow Wanda's desk, though empty, seemed to be the only thing she saw when she looked over to that side of the room. How had the 100 dresses game begun in the first place, she asked herself impatiently. It was hard to remember the time when they hadn't played that game with Wanda. Hard to think all the way back from now when the 100 dresses was like the daily dozen, to then when everything seemed much nicer. Oh yes, she remembered. It had begun that day when Cecile first wore her new red dress, and suddenly the whole scene flashed swiftly and vividly before Maddie's eyes. It was a bright blue day in September. No, it must have been October, because when she and Peggy were coming to school, arms around each other and singing, Peggy had said, "You know what? This must be the kind of day when they say October's bright blue weather." And Maddie remembered that because afterwards it didn't seem like bright blue weather anymore, although the weather had not changed in the slightest. As they turned from Shady Oliver Street into Maple, they both blinked, for now the morning sun shone straight in their eyes. And besides that, bright flashes of color came from a group of half-dozen or more girls across the street, their sweaters and jackets and dresses, blues and golds and reds, and one crimson. One in particular caught the sun rays like bright pieces of glass. A crisp, fresh wind was blowing, swishing their skirts and blowing their hair in their eyes. The girls were all exclaiming and shouting, and each one was trying to talk louder than the others, and Maddie and Peggy joined the group, and the laughing and the talking. "Hi, Peg. Hi, Maddie," they were greeted warmly. "Look at Cecile." And what they were all exclaiming about was the dress that Cecile had on. A crimson dress with a cap and socks to match. And it was a bright new dress and very pretty. Everyone was admiring it and admiring Cecile. For long, slender Cecile was a toe dancer and wore fancier clothes than most of them. And she had her black satin bag with her precious white satin ballet slippers slung over her shoulders. Today was the day for her dancing lesson. Maddie sat down on the granite curbstone to tie her shoelaces. She listened happily to what they were saying. They all seemed especially jolly today, probably because it was such a bright day. Everything sparkled. Way down at the end of the street, the sun shimmered and turned to silver the blue water of the bay. Maddie had picked up a piece of broken mirror and flashed a small circle of light edged with rainbow colors onto the houses, the trees, and the top of the telegraph pole. And it was then that Wanda had come along with her brother Jake. They didn't often come to school together. Jake had to get to school very early because he helped old Mr. Heaney, the school janitor, with the furnace, or raking up the dry leaves, or other odd jobs before school opened. Today he must be late. Even Wanda looked pretty in the sunshine, and her pale blue dress looked like a piece of the sky in summer. And that old gray toboggan cap she wore, it must be something Jake had found, looked almost jaunty. And we're going to stop right here. And that will be it for the 100 dresses. Until next time.